For this activity, you're going to need those same supplies as usual, a pencil, markers, and your Ohlone notebook. All right, so last week or the week before we made this map. Last week we talked about some of the Ohlone facts and we specifically referred to the homes. Today I'm going to go to page 4. Please don't go to page 5. That's for another week. I'm going to go to page 4, the back of that homes. And today we're going to talk about the Ohlone people and the food that they ate. So I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to write food here in nice big letters. And I'm going to put that in a box. Okay, and again, I'm going to use those bullet points to tell me about the food. So remember, the Ohlone people can only eat what's in their habitat. They cannot go around and they don't have Target or Safeway to go to. They can only eat what's around them. So the first thing we need to know about the Ohlone people is the Ohlone were hunters and gatherers. Okay, they hunted for food and they gathered food. So the Ohlone were hunters and gatherers. Okay, they're hunters and gatherers. Now, ladies, last week we couldn't go in the sweat house, but we have a very important thing that we do. The men were the hunters, the women were the gatherers. All right, so I'm going to make another bullet point here, and I'm going to say women. Okay, this was a female job. Women, not men. Women gathered acorns. All right, lots of oak trees in this area. They gathered acorns and crushed them into a powder. Okay. If you've ever seen an acorn, you know that it's quite hard. So you can imagine the amount of work it would take to crush them into a powder. All right. They crushed them into a powder, and that made like a mush, like an oatmeal kind of thing. Okay, that could be eaten. All right. They also gathered, I'm going to use a slash here because this continues on with that idea. They also gathered plants that were edible, roots, seeds, nuts, and berries. Okay, they gathered plants, roots, seeds, nuts, and berries, and so that they could be eaten. Okay, now I'm going to take my markers here and I'm going to illustrate a few of these things. So the first thing I'm going to illustrate is an acorn. All right, so acorns have sort of a round top and then they come down into sort of a point like that, and they usually have a little stem. Oh, I'm so sorry, you can't see that. Okay, so I'm just going to add a few acorns here and there. All right, those are my acorns. And they gathered plants and roots and seeds and nuts and berries. So you know what I'm going to draw here? I'm going to draw like a little Ohlone salad to show what the women gathered, because this looks and sounds kind of delicious. And the Ohlone were great basket makers too. So I'll take my brown pen. I'll draw a few acorns in here. Maybe I'll add a few berries. I'll take my red marker and I'll add some berries. Got a lot of blackberries around here that grow wild too, which are probably really delicious. All right, and we also have some naturally growing grasses and lettuces and some plants. So I'll draw some leaves here. We got ourselves a nice little Ohlone salad. When they say roots, that can mean like carrots, naturally growing carrots, and dandelion weeds and things like that. Okay, so and I'm going to label that now that I've drawn that. So we've got acorns, we've got berries, and we've got plants. Okay. Something else I want to remind you of, and we've already had the field trip with the Coyote Hills docent, but he did talk about how they crushed the acorns, and they used a tool called a mortar and pestle. So, and you can say it two ways. You can say pestle or pestle. I've looked it up because it bothers me. I can never figure out how people say it correctly, but I looked it up, and apparently you can say it both ways. So one of the things that they would do is they would take a rock. Maybe there'd be like a rock, you know, and they'd sort of sit on the rock, and then they would take another rock that was sharper. So this is a rock, and they would take another rock that would fit in their hand that kind of looked like this, and they would grind it like this. They'd put the acorns in, and they'd grind that rock. I'm sorry, they'd grind that acorn against that rock until it crumbled and made like a powder. And they would use that, and that made a mush. So this would be called, I'm sorry, you guys aren't going to be able to see that. This would be called a pestle or pestle, P-E-S, like pest and then L-E. And they would grind it to make that powder, okay? Well, women weren't the only ones who were helping with the food situation, okay? Women were gatherers, but remember, they were hunters and gatherers. So you guessed it, the men were the hunters. So I'm going to put another bullet point down here underneath our little Ohlone salad here. And I'm going to say, men hunted and fished. So ladies, we were gathering things and grinding things and cooking. Men, you were out hunting and fishing. Okay, so some of the things that they hunted and fished, I'm going to put a dash here to clarify what they hunted. They hunted local deer. Okay, they hunted deer, elk, not elf, elk, fox, squirrels. Those must have been extremely hard to hunt. Squirrels, rabbits, and geese. And those geese were probably seasonal, flying down from Canada, okay? Well, what kinds of tools did they use to hunt? All right, well, they used bow and arrows. All right, bows and arrows. They made their own arrowheads. They used bows and arrows, and for fishing, it's kind of hard to fish with a bow and arrow, they used fishing nets, handheld nets. They didn't have like a fishing line and a hook and sinker and all that kind of thing. Okay, so they used bow and arrows and fishing nets. So now I'm going to draw a few of those tools that the men used. I used my brown marker, and if you have it black, here's my black marker. All right, so I'm going to use my black marker, and I'm going to draw that bow. So the bow is like a capital D. But then they would decorate it, right? It wasn't just a simple bow. They decorate it with maybe hides of things they've caught or shells of things they'd found, right? So we have a bow here, and then our arrows. Now the arrows were made of willow again, and then they would use bird feathers, feathers that they had caught or maybe hunted the birds. And then that arrowhead was made of obsidian, which is a black rock, volcanic rock. All right, so there's some of our arrows. I'll draw another one just for fun. So we have that willow, we have those feathers of birds that they've hunted, and then that obsidian arrowhead, sharp, sharp volcanic rock. And then the fishing net looked something like this. It almost looked like a little bit of a lacrosse net. So it starts as a somewhat fish shape or eye shape, and then it had a long handle, right? Because if you scare the fish away, they're going to go too fast. You're not going to be able to get it. And then it had a basket that hung from it, like a net. Okay, and I'm going to draw the netting like this. I'm just going to cross the lines And then I'll go back over and draw the net. The net had to be fine enough that the fish couldn't swim through the holes. Okay, so that was a fishing net. Now I'm going to use my pencil to label those things so I remember. So this is a bow, decorated with shells. Okay, these are the arrows. All right, and this, we said that arrowhead was made of obsidian, that volcanic rock, obsidian arrowhead. And then this over here we said was the fishing net. Okay, so that, my friends, is a little bit about the Ohlone food. And we're starting to learn a little bit about what the men and the women were doing. It was a society that everybody had a job based on their gender. All right, make sure you get this finished up, and then next week we'll move on to some other things that the Ohlone did.